During the days when video games and computer games started to have role-playing games become more prominent within the separate mediums, the genre was pretty standard, with it mostly having players taking on a single or group of characters that were made to surround a particular game's lore. Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest have always been that way ever since they were conceived during the 80s, with many other games from different companies starting to become just as popular and well received in the critical and commercial status quo. However, an evolution to the genre of role-playing games would soon step up to the plate that would still have a big influence toward many different franchises, including Final Fantasy to this very day. This evolution would actually be conceived from another genre that has been around since the 70s, known as MUDs, or multi-user dungeons by definition. MUDs were maze and dungeon-like games where many people could play together within the same game, on the same local server, or even through the internet to see who would come out on top, since most of them were about competition. The first game to introduce this genre came in 1974 in the form of Maze War. Maze War was a first-person shooter MUD where players go through randomly generated mazes to find other players to shoot them down to see who was king of the hill in various matches. The next to come was MUD1, where the focus was on a fantasy adventure through text-based gameplay. By 1985, early commercial development for MUD started to become a thing with the arrival of Island of Kesmai for the CompuServe online service. Island of Kesmai was the first to inspire many of the traditions that would be found in massive multiplayer online role-playing games that were soon to become mainstream, such as having character creation and going through the different virtual worlds via chat room servers. However, it would be dethroned when Stormfront Studios' own Neverwinter Nights on the MS-DOS would come about in 1991 that brought about the visual representations of a gaming world because of the in-game engine for the computer showing graphics of the game's setting. During Neverwinter Nights' reign through 1991 to 1997, massive multiplayer online role-playing games on the internet started to become even more commercial now that the internet started to become more mainstream, thanks to it appearing commercial through Windows 95 computers. Richard Garriott, the creator of the Ultima series, officially coined the term MMORPG when it came to the release of the first MMORPG in 1997, Ultima Online. Even though the game played more from an aerial overhead view, many of the earliest conventions found in MMORPGs started to become a thing, such as having mission-based objectives to follow a story, which was prominent with older material such as the Fallout franchise that was originally owned by Interplay and the Elder Scrolls series by Bethesda Softworks. Another original convention was the inclusion of player versus player combat, or PvP for short, after it became a popular thing with many older games and MUDs combined. Many of these foundations laid the groundwork for massive multiplayer online role-playing games that have made Ultima Online still stand the test of time, even after 20 years since its release. However, one game would come about that would revolutionize the genre even further by making it the first MMORPG to be set in a 3D environment, with Sony Online Entertainment's own EverQuest, as it managed to make fantasy MMORPGs become more mainstream to the Western audience. EverQuest's arrival in the United States made it become commercially successful for 5 years after its launch, and it became the basis for 16 expansions and several derivative games that were to arrive. EverQuest was what inspired Hironobu Sakaguchi to make a new Final Fantasy game entered the MMORPG genre for what would eventually become known as Final Fantasy XI. The idea to develop Final Fantasy XI as an online game was conceived by Hironobu Sakaguchi when establishing Square Pictures' headquarters in Hawaii, and development of the CGI animated film Final Fantasy The Spirits Within was being produced. Impressed by Western MMORPGs such as EverQuest, The Realm Online, and even Ultima Online by Richard Garriott, Sakaguchi convinced Square to begin development of their own MMORPG and suggested that it be based on the Final Fantasy series. The team responsible for Chrono Cross, the spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger, was assigned to the development of Final Fantasy XI after the English localization of Chrono Cross was completed. When Final Fantasy XI began development in November 1999, the game was the first to be developed under the company's new philosophy to develop for quote-unquote all platforms and media, an initiative they would bring about for the rest of the series in both spin-off and main entries combined. Longtime developer of Square, Hiromichi Tanaka, was brought onto the project as the game's head producer, and stated that Final Fantasy XI is heavily influenced by Final Fantasy III on the Famicom, especially in its battle and magic systems. According to Tanaka, Square put in Final Fantasy XI what they could not put in the first Final Fantasy titles due to technical limitations, thus making Final Fantasy XI the quote-unquote most representative Final Fantasy of all the episodes. During the game's development, Final Fantasy XI cost about 2 to 3 billion yen to make, which equates to $17 million to $25 million in US currency. On top of the game's overall budget, the Play Online network service was revamped after its initial usage to look up exclusive information in Final Fantasy IX to uncover secrets that players can get their hands on based on certain objectives. The Play Online feature was planned for Final Fantasy X, but was scrapped due to the unpopularity of the feature in its initial stage. Thus, the Play Online feature was fully revamped to be the access point to log into the service and access the unified single server. This service was recreated as a hub for players to receive emails from Square, other players, receive news on upcoming events, and friendly chat amongst those within a buddy list. The Play Online network service in Final Fantasy XI was originally assumed to become profitable over a 5-year time span. By creating a unified game world instead of different ones balkanized by language, development costs were cut 66%, to make it more cheaper than extremely large in the overall budget. Since recurring monsters in the series like Tunberry, Cactuar, and others had different names between their Japanese and English counterparts, it was decided for Final Fantasy XI to use both Japanese and English names for different varieties of the same monsters. Final Fantasy XI was originally announced that there would be a simultaneous release on the PlayStation 2 and Microsoft Windows computers, as well as a concurrent Japanese and American release, but was later changed. There was one point of discussion where Final Fantasy XI would also appear on Microsoft's Xbox platform, but was abandoned because of its small 8GB hard drive. Final Fantasy XI's name was announced in January 2000 at the Yokohama Millennium Conference, but there was a great deal of negative press because of many questions raised towards Square's decision to naming their new MMORPG as the 11th entry to the Final Fantasy franchise. There wasn't any clear indication whether or not the game would have a structured story, but that feature that made Final Fantasy games so memorable was implemented in the final product. Aside from Hiromichi Tanaka being the game's main producer, many veterans of the Final Fantasy franchise lended their likeliness toward their first MMORPG, such as Koichi Ishii as the original director. Ken Narita became the game's main programmer. Nobuo Uematsu lent his support by composing the game's main theme, along with Naoshi Mitsuda and Kumi Tanioka working on the overall soundtrack. Masato Kato from Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VII, and Xenogears fame worked on the plot conception and event planning, while Nobuaki Komoto ended up being the scenario writer. Finally, Tetsuya Nomura would also provide some of the character designs for 2 out of the 5 character races, as well as non-playable characters in relation to the main story, while Ryosuke Aiba would be the game's main art director. During the 2.5 years of the development that was put into the game, Final Fantasy XI arrived on the PlayStation 2 first on May 16, 2002 in Japan, with the game coming onto Microsoft Windows platforms that November. With the overseas release in 2003, Final Fantasy XI came out on the PC first, and not on the PlayStation 2 since it was the original platform the game released on. During the PC version's release in North America on October 28, 2003, more hype was being placed into the PlayStation 2 version as Sony launched a multi-million-dollar ad campaign to promote the game, along with the PlayStation 2 hard disk drive and network adapter add-ons which the game required. Having been released on the PlayStation 2 as well as the personal computer, Final Fantasy XI became the first cross-platform MMORPG ever created. Early issues with the Japanese version came about with bugs and text interference that numerous patches would become a recurring thing for the game to keep it up to date and optimized for the whole experience. By the time when the game was released in North America, the earliest issues were that the starting players were already playing with experienced players from Japan who had already beaten the main storyline. Square responded by adding new servers in order to have more game worlds with fewer expert players. Many of these issues weren't that commonplace when Europe finally received the game on the PC in 2004, where the PlayStation 2 version was completely omitted from their own territory. As time went on, the game would eventually see a release on the Xbox 360 because of the bigger hard drive space than what was seen in the original Xbox. A Nintendo Wii version was considered for the launch of the console in late 2006, but was scrapped because of Nintendo's use of friend codes instead of having an all-in-one buddy list. As of now, Final Fantasy XI will be made available on the Android and iOS smartphones, truly making the game one of the biggest cross-platform MMORPGs since its existence. Final Fantasy XI takes place in a fictional world called Vana'diel, a diverse planet with regions that ranged from deserts that were blinding hot to ice-cold glaciers. Vana'diel's population ranges from the enlightened races and beastmen to simple fiends. The enlightened races consist of humans, the most common race in Vana'diel, and are known for their intelligence and high level of skill in numerous areas. They have abilities that are equally balanced, and are said to be cursed by the sin of apathy, making them service the game's human race. The Elvan are a race of proud warriors that have an unshakable pride with faith in their beliefs, and many eschew the business world, preferring an austere lifestyle as skilled sword fighters. The Elvan race possess high strength in mind, but suffer low MP and intelligence, as they are cursed with the sin of arrogance. The Gulka are a hulking race of extremely powerful warriors that are all consisted of males by gender, but reproduce through reincarnation. They possess the highest HP and vitality, but also the lowest MP as they are cursed by rage. The Mithra are a race of hunters who are mostly known for their energy, curiosity, and their penchant for causing playful mischief. Most of the race is comprised of females, as males are extremely rare, which makes the former the only playable gender in their race. Mithra possess high dexterity and agility, but at the cost of low HP and charisma, which curses the race with envy. Finally, there are a small race of halflings called the Taru, people who are skilled with magic that physically resemble children, where it doesn't reflect their age. These creatures are playful yet cunning, as they have the highest MP and intelligence for both males and females, but with the lowest HP and strength, as they are cursed with cowardice. The world of Vana'diel is separated by many continents, with its biggest being Quan, that is mostly populated by the Hume, Elvan, and Gulka races by a 6:3:1 ratio. The main nations within the continent consist of the Elvan Kingdom of Sandoria, the Human Republic of Bastuk, and the Grand Duchy of Juno. The continent to the east of Quan is Mindartia, where its biggest city is the Federation of Windurst. Other continents in the world are Kuzatz in the southwest, Elshimo in the far south, and Eradisia in the far east. Many of these continents and regional areas within them brim with their own climates, weather, and wildlife, as they can vary between every one of them. In Vana'diel's history from 20 years past before the present, a devastating war occurred where the Middleland nations of Sandoria, Bastuk, and Windurst stood up and defeated the Shadow Lord and his army of beastmen. This conflict was known as the Crystal War, as anyone can surmise that the Shadow Lord wants to bring about supreme conquest by destroying the crystal with no stop. At the present time, the aftermath of the war is the basis of the game's story, as players must create their own character that is dubbed the Adventurer to ban the three main countries once more by undergoing missions in order to go up against the resurrected Shadow Lord, as he plots his revenge for his defeat from 20 years prior. Since Final Fantasy games from the original 10 entries had staple heroes in the plot to fight off against the forces of evil, Final Fantasy XI is the first in the series where players can create their own characters by selecting their looks, gender, and race between the Humes, Elvan, Gulka, Mithra, and Taru. At the beginning, players are also given the option to start off in the Kingdom of Sandoria, the Republic of Bastuk, or the Federation of Windurst, to pledge their initial allegiance. Gameplay in Final Fantasy XI undergoes a complete revision with new additions not done to the overall formula, since it is the first to accommodate the MMORPG genre. The player's created character starts off with no job, little money, and at a small level before they are given the opportunity to grow even more. Most of the story in the main game consists of missions that will give the created character ranks that increases in number to be rewarded with more privileges such as stronger weapons, armor, and more jobs to access. When playing in the online world of Vana'diel, the nations, cities, dungeons, and overworld areas will have so many people playing the game at the same time as many others, thanks to the overall game having 16 different servers that can hold up to nearly 20,000 users within a single one. Many of the missions in Final Fantasy XI require the players to fight, and may involve battlefields with unique notorious monsters. Others may require the player to acquire a particular item, undergo a delivery, speaking to a particular NPC, or even playing a minigame. Progress and completion of the missions often will unlock numerous benefits to the player, such as access to newer areas, increasing rank, crucial features such as airships, and unique pieces of equipment among other things. Missions are what will keep the story moving forward, while quests are completely optional in case the player wants to undertake filler to become even stronger. Utilizing a checklist of objectives within the game would be mandatory for every player, as making use of the Record of Eminence gives a variety of objectives so that players can complete them to gain experience points and earn sparks for a unity. Unities are groups for players to be a part of, as they have their own benefits over the other. Plus, if players wanted to chat with Unity members, they could do just that, or they could chat with others through the link shell system if they needed help or guidance from others. If players found it too hard to undergo the missions and quests all by themselves, they can team up with other players in order to get the job done a lot faster and to get stronger much easier. If finding other players to play with proved to be cumbersome to many, the alternative in creating their own parties came in the form of summoning alter egos of certain individuals called trusts. Clans are not a prominent thing in Final Fantasy XI, as the adventure is mostly dedicated to the created character for every player. When going through the game and when crisscrossing between nations for progression, so many variables in the gameplay are present for players. Traveling through the towns and dungeons in a non-linear format return, and the traditional staples such as talking to NPCs, shopping for items and equipment, fighting in battles between regular enemies and bosses, auction houses to bid for more powerful equipment and items, and many others become present in Final Fantasy XI. Even though Final Fantasy XI is the first MMORPG in the series, the retainment of those traditional staples to a role-playing game would be enough for anyone to take pleasure that a franchise like Final Fantasy hasn't strayed away from what made it a name to begin with, while revising mechanics and introducing newer ones in the process. Final Fantasy XI would see a return of the aforementioned job system that was seen in the original game, but heavily improved upon in Final Fantasy III. Unlike what was seen in most MMORPGs, this game did not restrict players from undergoing only one class per character, as they could switch jobs whenever they like at certain designated locations such as inside their monk house, the player's own room for home, and the 3 default locations in Vana'diel. The only downside is that each job would treat itself as its own character, since all jobs would have the players at level 1 to start them off. At the beginning, players start off with one of the 6 standard jobs to get acquainted with their specific abilities and equipment they can procure. The 6 standard jobs pay an homage to the first Final Fantasy, with the 6 job types to start off for the Warriors of Light: Warrior, Monk, White Mage, Black Mage, Red Mage, and Thief. The unique merit to each job when compared to past entries in the series is that they have their own abilities that originated in this game. For example, the Warrior job has unique abilities such as Berserk and Defender, where the character can increase their strength or defense, while the other could be decreased. On top of the abilities that can be obtained for the specific jobs, they each have their own traits to give buffs and bonuses to the character's own stats like attack bonuses, max hit point boosts, etc. The equipment between physical, magical, and dexterous characters all differed from each other just like past games. By continuing the tradition of characters grinding their levels to become stronger, their selected jobs can also increase in levels so that newer potential can be achieved. By the time when a player's job reaches level 30 for their adventurer, they can upgrade into a more advanced class for more opportunities to grow and learn newer abilities they so desire. Those 6 advanced jobs are a Paladin, Dark Knight, Beastmaster, Bard, Ranger, and Summoner. Probably the most unique attribute of the job system in Final Fantasy XI is the support job mechanic. The system can allow players to augment their character with abilities, traits, and spells from another chosen job at up to half the level of their current job, so that they can utilize those specific abilities of a secondary job into their character's primary job. If a player wanted to use a level 20 warrior with a level 10 ninja, they could do so just that, while still growing their primary job at their current leisure. In a sense, it borrows a bit from the job system from Final Fantasy V in that regard, but remains original for merging jobs so that they can be grinded in tandem with one another. However, certain restrictions are applied within the support job system, as certain abilities for specific jobs cannot be utilized, as they are bound to a character's primary job only. Not to mention, there have been adjustments made to lower the effectiveness of certain abilities when used on support jobs ever since the game's release. As per the tradition of most games in the series, Final Fantasy XI's tradition of grinding a character's levels through experience points is brought back, after Final Fantasy X's experimentation with the sphere grade system may have alienated fans who wanted to revert back to basics. Experience points in Final Fantasy XI can be gained through various means, such as defeating foes, completing quests and missions, campaign battles, and various activities. To gain experience, it is usually common in RPGs where characters are up to a level that is concurrent with an enemy's level and stats, so that players can grind in a natural manner like all the games in the series. Fighting higher level ones will net more experience points for faster growth, and battling monsters that are extremely weak will give little experience points upon victory. Those remain common in Final Fantasy XI, but the biggest difference is that defeating enemies that are too weak will not reward players with any experience points, as this has been a current tradition with MMORPGs, so that players don't try and cheat their way in growing stronger by fighting the same types of enemies over and over again. If players found it too hard to gain experience points by themselves, then they are given the option to form a party of up to 6 people so that they can work together to bring down stronger foes for more experience points to grind faster. This type of party is known as an experience party. Partying with other players online has become very common in MMORPGs, and it goes well with all the gameplay systems in Final Fantasy XI, as that element allows each player to take down harder enemies and excel their jobs at a grander and more gratuitous rate than solo play. By example, with white mages not being powerful in physical attacks, but more capable of healing since they have higher magic, pairing with a warrior who attacks with brute strength can help players utilize each of their own strengths and execute their abilities in rapid succession to ensure a much better victory against the monsters and beastmen throughout Vana'diel. Doing this will grant bonus experience points under the guise of a chain. A monster or group of enemies and their aggressive actions are determined by an enmity system, a system that will determine who is the most threatening in the hero's party during a fight, where monsters will try and attack that player alone just to turn the tide in their favor. Countering the enmity system means that a party battle must succeed in protecting those who have low defense, as the intelligence within monsters can get the best of a party if they are not careful. Players will have to pick and choose what actions they want to take while thinking about how it will affect their own enmity and the entire groups. Because of this factor, certain jobs are tasked with trying to create the most enmity as possible in order to make the monster have aggro toward that selected player. A full party can be formed with 6 members, but 3 parties can ally themselves to create an alliance where 18 players can work together to get through some of the hardest adversities in side quests and story-based missions. Although open-world battle content is limited to a full alliance at any time, many gameplay elements involving battlefields are designed to challenge even larger groups of players at one go. However, if players found it too difficult at first to adjust in forming parties and alliances to advance the game's story at a quick pace, they could resort to playing the hard way and traversing their adventure solo, or join smaller groups to take things slow. If they chose to take this route, players are also given the privilege to summon adventuring fellows to aid them in combat, including alter egos of famous characters throughout Vana'diel, known as trusts. The only difference is that adventuring fellows are AI-controlled NPCs that can be customized and even leveled up to suit a player's style, whereas trust alter egos are based on set heroes with their own special moves and unique AI, which players cannot customize. Finally, Final Fantasy XI also includes its own limit break system in the form of weapon skills. Weapon skills are executed when players gain tactical points by dealing physical damage, a trait that is common in Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy IX with the trance mode, and Final Fantasy X with the overdrive mechanic. In Final Fantasy XI, however, when the tactical points gauge reaches above 1,000, players are granted the opportunity to unleash weapon skills to attack enemies with significant prowess, along with the probability of receiving beneficial effects. Although tactical points can be charged to a maximum of 3,000 points, all of it is spent whenever a weapon skill is used, and are factored in to determine how effective that particular weapon skill is in that selected battle. To the player's benefit, taking advantage of selecting the appropriate weapon skills in the correct order and in succession will result in a skill chain. Skill chains come in different power levels and result in additional damage to enemies when in battle. Skill chains from a lower level can be chained upon further to result in stronger skill chain effects. By building onto this factor, players can deal additional damage by timing magic spells immediately after a skill chain occurs, which in turn can create an opportunity called a magic burst. Skill chains and magic bursts add an element of teamwork to battles, and are often required to take down the most challenging of opponents for progression. By having these elements to the gameplay intact, players could reach up to the original level cap of 50 so that they can take on more quests and missions solo than just solely relying on parties and alliances if they so desired. Continuing the tradition of trying to surpass the bar with every entry, Final Fantasy XI became another success in the critical and commercial status quo. Many publications were impressed by what they played, as they found it to be a welcomed addition amongst MMORPGs, since it used its own innovations from the past to experiment in a new direction for this installment. The world of Vana'diel, the missions, and the overall story were enough to grasp fans of Final Fantasy into the game, just to feel like they were a part of something bigger than playing as established characters in the past. However, Final Fantasy XI was not safe with all praise, as there was criticism inbound from both the press and gamers alike. On the side of the press, the biggest criticism came from the fact that the game required an initial registration and installation setup that proved to be lengthy and cumbersome to most players, and the fact that the game chose more of player versus environment gameplay instead of including player versus player aspects was possibly the game's biggest flaw. However, other areas that were largely criticized were the large amounts of grinding for experience points, which mostly involved constant battles to access different parts of Vana'diel, and the campsites were overcrowded with too many players. Perhaps this was Square's attempt at including more servers with the names of the Eidolons to counter this problem, but players were still experiencing veteran users who were in Japan that played the game much earlier than the West. On the side of the general public, they felt that the game came off being extremely tedious, as battles were slow-paced for an MMORPG, as utilizing the active time battle system dragged out the fights for quite a long while. Plus, they felt that the game being far more in favor of players forming parties and alliances with other players from around the world, instead of just playing by themselves, made the whole experience came off feeling more unbalanced and intuitive when it came to the missions and quests they would undertake. Not to mention, the necessary need of grinding for both experience points and money to either level up or buy items and equipment became more of a chore rather than an enjoyable time for many, two flaws that were first seen in the original Final Fantasy back in 1987. Despite the many other criticisms they had with the game, most of them praised many things within Final Fantasy XI, such as its own staples it brought into the MMORPG genre, the staples within the genre itself which became fitting for the whole game, such as weapon and item crafting, auction houses, as well as Vana'diel itself, and the fan service it brought about from the franchise, such as riding chocobos, having so many different jobs to choose from, and the original soundtrack that was conceived by Naoshi Mitsuda, Kumi Tanioka, and the legendary Nobuo Uematsu continues to impress the ears of many devoted fans. For its time of release on the PlayStation 2 and the PC, it was a well-received experience for many, despite the flaws it pertained in the finished product. However, the Xbox 360 version of the game received a more mixed reception due to the game being outdated to many because of many other MMORPGs that have surpassed the game in its current form, including not making a substantial leap in high-definition visuals, but received praise for the game utilizing the Xbox 360's online infrastructure, which was the console's selling point during that time. With every traditional game in the Final Fantasy series, Nobuo Uematsu became a contributor to the soundtrack along with Naoshi Mitsuda and Kumi Tanioka. Yasunori Mitsuda was also inquired to contribute to Final Fantasy XI's soundtrack, but was already busy working on Xenosaga for Monolith Soft and Namco. The opening theme of Final Fantasy XI features choral music with lyrics in Esperanto, which according to Uematsu, the choice of language was meant to symbolize the developers' hope that their online game could contribute to cross-cultural communication and cooperation. Uematsu also went on to note the increased difficulty of scoring a game for which there was no linear plotline, because of the game being that of a non-linear outcome instead of what he would do for his works he did on prior entries in the past. Some of the game's music became very iconic in their own right, such as the vocal Distant Worlds, which was not in the game by 2002, but placed in after a patch was released in July 2005. Distant Worlds would be the inspiration much later for Square Enix and Nobuo Uematsu's initiative, with performing songs from the entire franchise at concert halls from all over the world, which still goes on to this very day. Final Fantasy XI's overall soundtrack faced a mixed audience upon arrival, with it being another strong outing from Nobuo Uematsu, while some thought it came off disappointing for feeling slower and more repetitive than the previous outings. For a game with such a big open world, Final Fantasy XI seemed to hold many players' attention when it came to the numerous amounts of content that they wanted to immerse themselves into. Even though that was the case, those who utilized every single character type and perfected every primary and secondary job felt like they fully completed the adventure, with there being nothing more they could do to continue playing in Final Fantasy XI's online world. The number one thing that developers of MMOs managed to do to breathe a new life into a game within that particular genre was the creation of expansion packs to bring about all new content for more gamers to continue playing their product with higher replayability. EverQuest did so in order to keep many of its install base on their servers with continual play. Square obliged to the idea by getting into the initiative with creating their own expansion packs and numerous add-ons through updates to ensure more of their fans will continue playing in Vana'diel. Their first follow-up would be the creation of their first expansion pack called Rise of the Zillart, and it became a free upgrade to Western gamers when the game was bundled with both the PC and the PlayStation 2 release of the game in 2003 and 2004. Rise of the Zillart continues after the original storyline of the main game, with the adventurer finding out that a character called the Archduke of Juno and his brother are princes of an ancient race that survived extinction called the Zillart, and it is up to players to fight and stop them from opening the Gate of the Gods, which could easily destroy Vana'diel without mercy. This expansion would be the first in the trend of newer expansions to include new jobs, missions, quests, regions, dungeons, and expanded storylines to further the lore of Final Fantasy XI's online world. Rise of the Zillart introduced gamers to the advanced jobs of the Samurai, Ninja, and Dragoon, which harkens back to their job type from what was seen in past installments. A character's nation rank would go up to 10, 7 new regions with 39 areas become playable locations along with 5 new zones and 24 new enemies. New gameplay systems were also introduced, with a few being trial weapon skills, additional orb battles, the Dynamis and Ballista systems, and much more. If players found the level cap of 50 too short, then the Rise of the Zillart expansion bumped it up to 75. By the next year, a new expansion pack was released that went under the subtitle Chains of Promathia. Players would discover a phenomenon called the Emptiness is found eating away at the heart of Vana'diel, and the Worm King Bahamut declares that the arrival of the Keeper of the Apocalypse is near. An Alvan girl named Prish would work with a samurai named Tenzin to fight back the Emptiness, and a mysterious pale child seems to be at the center of the strange mystery that revolves around the Twilight god Promathia. 36 new enemies and bosses were created, 40 new areas amongst 5 new regions were brought about, and 13 new zones were introduced in Chains of Promathia. Unfortunately, no new character jobs or new gameplay mechanics were implemented. It wouldn't be until 2006 until the third expansion, Treasures of Ot Urgen, would arrive amongst the public, and would release alongside the launch of the Xbox 360 version along with the previous 2 expansions. In Treasures of Ot Urgen, the xenophobic Ot Urgen Empire opens the borders to the Middle Lands after years of self-imposed isolation. Worried about this new power, the leaders of each city sends representatives to assess the situation. The adventurer is chosen for the task of unearthing the Empire's true intentions and begins to uncover the secrets of the life-giving astrocandescence, the Dark Rider, and the history of this mysterious land. Treasures of Ot Urgen introduced the advanced character jobs of Blue Mage, Corsair, and Puppet Master. Corsair would be first introduced in Final Fantasy XI, as its job function plays out more of a sea pirate, where its gameplay mechanics are more to that of a gambler, while wielding a multi-barreled revolver called the Hexagon. 31 new enemies and bosses were created, 28 new locations within the 5 new regions were introduced to encompass the Ot Urgen Empire, and new gameplay mechanics such as chocobo racing and mythic weapons were introduced. By next year in 2007, the 4th expansion would arrive, and it was called Wings of the Goddess. In its story, cavernous maws appearing all over the land have been found to teleport adventurers 20 years into the past, when the Crystal War was being ravaged upon Vana'diel. The adventurer is met by Cait Sith, who asks for help in easing the suffering of the people during this time period. However, there are others who would alter the course of history to suit their own ends as well. 2 new jobs were brought about in the 4th expansion, the Dancer and Scholar jobs, 29 new enemies were conceived, and 30 new locations within the 9 new areas became playable. Wings of the Goddess was one of the most important expansions to come about because of its setting and hook to its plotline. Because of the setting taking place in the past and during the Crystal War, the newest gameplay mechanic introduced was campaign battles. These battles occur when the 3 great nations form an alliance called the Allied Forces of Altana so that they could fight off the Beastmen during this conflict. Players would work together to fight in many campaigns that came about in the story. However, battles within the campaign weren't the only restriction in the gameplay, as several other mission and quest-based objectives during the story centered around reconnaissance, supply missions, security operations, and much more become available to help the Alliance with the player's war efforts. These small-scale efforts are often referred to as campaign ops. After the release of the 4th expansion pack in 2007, no more news was made available between then and 2013, with there being another expansion set to come about. There were those in the install base who felt that Final Fantasy XI was drawing to a close because either the development team ran out of ideas, or that the scope of the game was already massive as it was. Others who didn't play Final Fantasy XI that much believed that most of the development team behind the game have left Square Enix, or that they began working on newer projects. Truth began to take effect when it came to those who stepped down from Final Fantasy XI to proceed in other projects or leaving Square to form their own companies. The game's original director, Koichi Ishii, left the project by the time when the Rise of the Zillard expansion was released, so that he could continue his work on the Mana series until his departure from Square in 2007 to form Grezzo, who primarily worked on games for the Nintendo platforms. Nobuaki Komoto succeeded Ishii as Final Fantasy XI's director for 5 years, and stepped down to work on the story for further expansions a year after Wings of the Goddess was released. Koichi Ogawa became the third director after Komoto, who continued to contribute to writing scenarios with Masato Kato, but Ogawa stepped down after 2 years, only to be briefly succeeded by Akihiko Matsui for some time in 2010. Matsui didn't direct long, as Mizuki Ito replaced him as the game's current director at this time. Koichi Ishii wasn't the only member of the original Final Fantasy team to leave Square, as Hiromichi Tanaka also followed suit in 2012 due to health reasons, and he would later resurface by working for the now gung-ho Online Entertainment. Akihiko Matsui arrived back on the development team of Final Fantasy XI after Tanaka's departure, only to be the game's current producer going forward. When it came to the expansions, Naoshi Matsuda would continue to contribute to all of the soundtracks by himself, as Nobuo Uematsu left Square Enix in 2004 to become freelance in many other projects outside of the company, but would continue to contribute to Final Fantasy XI unless it was a famous piece of work he would want to arrange or update. Kumi Tanioka wouldn't work on any more songs for Final Fantasy XI after the original game launched in 2002, as she continued work on more games for both the Chocobo and Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles line of video games before her departure from the company in 2010 to become freelance like Uematsu. While no new expansions were being worked on, several patches and updates were being made to ensure further stability, balancing of difficulty, and adding on new scenarios and other goodies when Square made those features available. The first of these would be 3 new scenarios that were conceived by Masato Kato, who would continue to pen new stories after he departed from Square when Rise of the Zillard was released, and they were meant to act as interactive novellas that focused on deepening the storylines of existing locations rather than introducing newer ones. These 3 stories were called A Crystalline Prophecy, Ode of Life Bestowing, a Mugo Kupo Detat, Evil in Small Doses, and a Shantoto Ascension, The Legend Torn, Her Empire Born. These stories were made to tie up several storylines that the developer wanted to see fully fleshed out, and to have a proper conclusion to those subplots. Its simple fetch quest beginning was something that many experienced players criticized toward after the add-ons became available, but Masato Kato has gone on to state that the fetch quest aspect was made for beginners in mind. By the next year, Square would begin subsequent updates until December 2011 that would see players finally reaching the highest level of 99, so that they would have no troubles with Vana'diel alone. But something was made in between to challenge them and put their gameplay skills to the test. During 2010, while the level caps were slowly being raised, a new realm called Abyssia was conceived to take form of an add-on battlefield that went under 3 campaigns with the intent of challenging players between level 75 and up in mind. There, players partake in activities such as leveling, engaging battles against foes, and collecting powerful equipment that would benefit them more than what they already had. This battlefield went under 3 episodes called Vision of Abyssia, Scars of Abyssia, and Heroes of Abyssia, where each story had their own unique plotline and challenges. For the next 3 years and after the add-on battlefields were released, nothing more would come out of Final Fantasy XI during that time period, as many were starting to come to the conclusion that Vana'diel was already on its last rope, with already being completed by Square. In thinking that there was no new expansion being worked on, their fears were immediately put to rest, as Square announced in 2012 at Vana'fest, an annual festival held after Final Fantasy XI's release to celebrate the game and the world of Vana'diel that was held in Yokohama, Japan, that the game was indeed to bring about a 5th expansion that would celebrate the 10th anniversary of Final Fantasy XI's Japanese release. It would be the only expansion to never release on the PlayStation 2 outside of Japan, since the console was now a forgotten market after the 7th generation consoles arrived in full force, but it would still release on the PC and Xbox 360 for all Western territories by 2013. This new expansion would be dubbed Seekers of Adalin, and it would introduce the last 2 jobs, Geomancer and Rune Fencer. Rune fencers are masters of swordplay, while enchanting the art of elemental runes to their blade, which can sway the tide of battle to the players both offensively and defensively. Missions and quests took place in the newest location, the primordial continent of Albuka, where the sacred city of Adalin serves as the main hub for the expansion. 20 new enemies were introduced that would appear in 22 different locations between the 4 new regions, while 4 other areas were also brought about. Not to mention, 7 powerful bosses were amongst the new enemies to test the players, the parties, and alliances that all came together within the 10 years of the game's existence. Because of it being the last expansion to release, only 5 new gameplay systems were conceived, such as colonization and coalition assignments. After Seekers of Adalin was released, no more expansions were made, as followers of Final Fantasy XI were treated to a commemorative end to the game's 13-year history by bringing about a free update to this final main scenario called Rhapsodies of Vana'diel in 2015. It was billed as the ultimate compilation of all that Square has accomplished to date, with major characters from throughout the game's history making appearances. This new and final main scenario consisted of 3 chapters that were released for free after debuting in the May, August, and November 2015 version updates respectively, and would ensure closure to the entirety of Vana'diel's existence and overall lore that were seen by its devoted legions of fans throughout all the years. Final Fantasy XI has endured a precarious existence throughout its 15-year history. At face value, the game did not seem like it would work amongst the growing number of massive multiplayer online role-playing games that were hitting the market after Ultima Online started that trend, and with EverQuest completely revolutionizing it in the 3D space. Many people who have or have not played Final Fantasy XI would continue to compare it to EverQuest or label the game as nothing more than a mere clone that did not do anything substantially original to make it stand out by a vast margin, thus feeling like a game that would come off as inconceivable. However, many of the franchise's staples that came from Final Fantasy III and used as a template for Final Fantasy XI's creation have symbolized the ideology of Vana'diel as one of Square Enix's growing number of worlds in the overall franchise. The initial product came off being a divisive experience because of numerous problems such as the MMO not starting off at the same time with all regions from around the world, and the constant push of a multiplayer adventure over a solo one because of its difficulty spikes when playing alone rendered Final Fantasy XI as an entry that was hard to get into, regardless of one's affinity to the franchise. Because of this, many felt that the online world of Vana'diel would only be followed by a vocal minority who enjoy it for what it initially was, but the strong reception of the numerous expansions, add-ons, and the plethora of patches helped balance Final Fantasy XI into a more enjoyable and important entry in the long term. In 2006, between 200,000 and 300,000 active players logged in per day, with 500,000 total active players and around 150,000 only at any one time. By April 2009, Square Enix announced that the total number of active characters exceeded 2 million for the first time, and those numbers continued to grow despite at a slow pace. Final Fantasy XI was enough to rival many of the MMOs that came before its release as well as this very day, but it would be fully surpassed in 2004 with the arrival of Blizzard Entertainment's own MMORPG called World of Warcraft that completely exceeded the standards of the genre and brought it into a more modern age, whereas games like EverQuest and Final Fantasy XI appeared outdated and antiquated for today's standards. With World of Warcraft's arrival, the number of users in the game's overall install base surpassed that of many of the past MMOs that continued to thrive by bringing about its own expansions, updates, and add-on content to appeal to all gamers, along with being updated for the time of high-definition gaming in the long term. Despite Final Fantasy XI appearing more of a relic by many gamers of the MMORPG genre, and with its current user base for the game, the former president and CEO of Square Enix, Yuichi Wada, announced that Final Fantasy XI had become the most profitable title in the series of all time, according to a press release in June 2012. Its break into profitability began in 2003, with more revenue being earned on a yearly basis for Square. Because of its existence, and with World of Warcraft surpassing Final Fantasy XI, the game would only serve as a blueprint to help shape up the next MMORPG in the franchise from being a mediocre experience upon its initial launch in 2010 into one of the most richest games after its relaunch within the next few years. Final Fantasy XI continues to breathe life after 15 years of its release, with it being ported to Japanese mobile devices between Square Enix and Nexon, but only to become its own thing without sharing servers or characters with the existing database seen on other platforms. While that is being worked on, a free-to-play spin-off of Final Fantasy XI was brought to the iOS and Android devices under the name Final Fantasy Grandmasters that became more of an online RPG that uses the series' signature turn-based battle system. Currently, the spin-off is an exclusive release in Japan and has passed over 1 million downloads at this time. Whether Final Fantasy XI will make an appearance on other consoles in future generations of hardware remains uncertain, but certain possibilities came up, like porting the game to the PlayStation Vita was brought about in 2012 by Hiromichi Tanaka. Unfortunately, no official announcement of that version has ever been made public. While this had more to do with the PlayStation Vita's poor sales and performance from a global standpoint, the chances for the world of Vana'diel to appear on there becomes more slim for those who still own the platform. Luckily, Final Fantasy XI and Vana'diel continue to be promoted and talked about to this very day, with several written adaptations and related merchandise being made available long after the original game's release in 2002. Even though Final Fantasy XI has been officially completed in terms of story, expansions, and add-ons, its existence still goes strong to this very day, with many of its install base coming back into Vana'diel on a daily basis. If it was to explore more of the large online world, to further explore more of the world's lore and history, or to just simply restart the adventure with newly created characters and to add new friends to the Play Online service to further broaden its appeal, Final Fantasy XI will always be remembered for what it accomplished as a massive multiplayer online role-playing game. Vana'diel will always be remembered by those who grew accustomed to the world, and Final Fantasy XI will continue to be played throughout whatever years the game has left and the newest platforms it may appear on. May we as gamers remember the rich and eclectic world of Vana'diel. Always. Next time in RRPG's Final Fantasy Retrospective, the next game in the main series would be conceived many years before its own existence came to light in 2006, and it would become the newest holocron of polymorphic content where gamers would be introduced to the grand history and luxurious world known only as Ivalice.